Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that will shatter every romanticized notion you've ever had about Viking culture. We're diving into the brutal reality of being a thrall, a Viking slave, in medieval Scandinavia. Forget the Hollywood warriors with flowing hair and noble hearts. Tonight, you're not Ragnar Lothbrok. You're property, human livestock in a world where your life has less value than a decent sword. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're working in your fields on a quiet morning in Anglo-Saxon England. The mist hangs low over the barley, and you're thinking about the harvest, about your family, about whether the weather will hold. Then you hear it, the sound that turns blood to ice water. War horns echoing across the valley, followed by screams from the village. The Vikings have come, and your life as you know it is about to end forever. Within hours, you'll be chained to a dozen other terrified souls, marched to a longship and shipped across the North Sea like cargo. Your name will be forgotten. Your family will mourn you as dead. And for the rest of your miserable existence, you'll belong to someone else, body and soul. But here's what's truly horrifying about Viking slavery. It wasn't just brutal, it was systematic, calculated, an entire economic engine built on human suffering that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. Tonight, we're going to explore just how deep this rabbit hole goes, how Vikings captured slaves, how they used them, how they broke them, and how the entire Norse world depended on this horrific trade. Because when you understand the reality of being a thrall, you'll never look at Viking culture the same way again. Welcome to medieval Scandinavia, where your worth as a human being could be measured in silver coins, and freedom was a luxury most people would never taste. The word itself should chill you, thrall. In Old Norse, it literally means one who serves. But that clinical definition doesn't capture the horror. A thrall wasn't just a servant. They were breathing property, less valuable than a good horse, more expendable than livestock, and infinitely more breakable than any tool in a Viking household. Let's start with how you became one, because understanding the capture is crucial to understanding the nightmare that followed. Viking raids weren't just about gold and glory. They were shopping trips, human trafficking expeditions designed to stock the slave markets of medieval Europe. When those longships appeared on your horizon, half the crew wasn't there for treasure. They were there for you. The process was methodical. Vikings would strike coastal settlements at dawn when resistance was minimal and escape routes limited. They'd separate the population immediately. The old and infirm, dead weight. Literally, they were killed on the spot or left to starve. Children too young to work. Same fate. But if you were between roughly 10 and 40, healthy and capable of labor, congratulations. You just won the worst lottery in human history. The selection process was brutal in its efficiency. Vikings could assess human value with the cold precision of livestock traders, strong backs for manual labor, skilled craftsmen for specialized work, young women for domestic duties and, inevitably, sexual exploitation, children old enough to train but young enough to break psychologically. Each category had its place in the thrall economy, and each came with its own unique brand of suffering. But here's where it gets even darker. Vikings didn't just raid randomly. They had intelligence networks. They knew which monasteries held valuable manuscripts and which villages had skilled metalworkers. They knew seasonal patterns, when men would be away for harvest, or when settlements would be most vulnerable. This wasn't barbaric chaos. It was organized crime on an industrial scale. Once captured, you'd be processed like livestock. Chained together in long lines called coffles, marched to the coast where longships waited. The journey itself was designed to break you psychologically. You'd watch friends and family members collapse from exhaustion and be left to die. You'd see resistance crushed with such vicious efficiency that the thought of escape would seem not just impossible, but suicidal. And then came the crossing. Packed into the cargo holds of longships like sardines, wallowing in your own filth, drinking brackish water, eating mouldy bread, if you were lucky enough to eat at all. Many didn't survive the voyage, but if you did, if you somehow endured the weeks of horror crossing the North Sea, you'd emerge into a world where your humanity had been systematically stripped away. The slave markets of medieval Scandinavia were bustling centres of commerce. Hedeby, Birka, Kaupang. These weren't just trading posts. They were human supermarkets where people were bought and sold like any other commodity. You'd be displayed naked, examined for physical defects, tested for skills, and valued according to your potential utility. Buyers would check your teeth like you were a horse. They'd feel your muscles, examine your hands for calluses that might indicate useful skills, and assess your psychological state to determine how much breaking you'd require. The whole process was designed to dehumanize you completely, to transform you from a person with hopes and dreams into a thing with a price tag. But the true horror of becoming a thrall wasn't just the initial capture and sale. It was the realization that this was forever. There was no parole system, no path to redemption, no light at the end of the tunnel. You were property now, and property doesn't dream of freedom. It just endures. Now that you've been processed, branded, and sold, let's talk about what your new life actually looked like. Because if you thought the capture was bad, you were catastrophically unprepared for what came next. First, understand that, as a thrall, you had no rights whatsoever. None. You couldn't own property, couldn't marry without permission, couldn't travel, couldn't speak in legal proceedings, couldn't even choose what you ate for breakfast. Your master owned your body, your labor, your children, and in many cases, your very soul. You were a human tool, and tools don't have opinions. Your living conditions would make modern prison cells look luxurious. Most thralls slept in the coldest, dampest corners of their master's longhouse. No beds, just straw if you were lucky, bare earth if you weren't. No blankets, no privacy, no protection from the bitter Scandinavian winters that could kill you in your sleep. You'd huddle together with other slaves for warmth, creating a hierarchy of misery where even the most degraded human being needed someone to look down on. Food was whatever was left over. Spoiled meat, mouldy bread, thin gruel made from scraps. Your master's dogs often ate better than you did. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was economic calculation. Why waste good food on property when just enough calories to keep you working would suffice? If you weakened, if you couldn't perform your duties, you could always be replaced. And speaking of duties, your workday began before dawn and ended after dark. There were no weekends, no holidays, no sick days. If you could stand, you could work. If you couldn't stand, you were probably dying, and dying thralls were disposed of quickly and efficiently. The work itself varied, depending on your skills and your master's needs. Agricultural thralls spent their days in the fields, breaking their backs over rocky soil with primitive tools. Domestic thralls cleaned, cooked, and served, always under the watchful eye of their masters. Skilled thralls might work as blacksmiths, carpenters, or weavers, but even specialized labor came with its own dangers. Make a mistake, damage a tool, displease your master in any way, and punishment was swift and brutal. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of thrall life was the constant reminder of your worthlessness. You weren't beaten just for disobedience. You were beaten to reinforce your place in the social order. You weren't just enslaved. You were deliberately broken, systematically dehumanized until you internalized your own worthlessness. Viking society had developed sophisticated methods of psychological control that went far beyond physical restraint. They understood that the most effective slavery wasn't just about chains and whips. It was about convincing the slave that they deserved their fate, that they were naturally inferior, that resistance was not just futile, but morally wrong. This psychological warfare began the moment you arrived at your master's household. You'd be given a new name, usually something degrading that reinforced your status. Your old identity would be systematically erased. Your gods, your customs, your language, everything that connected you to your former life would be slowly stripped away until you could barely remember who you'd been before. The clothing you wore marked you as property. Thralls dressed in the coarsest fabrics, often just rough-spun wool or even sackcloth. No jewelry, no ornamentation, nothing that might suggest you had any status or dignity. You were a walking advertisement for your own degradation. And then there were the more subtle humiliations. Thralls ate after everyone else, from wooden bowls, while their masters used proper dishes. They couldn't speak unless spoken to. They had to avert their eyes when free people passed. They had to step aside on paths, sleep on floors, and accept that their lives had less value than their master's livestock. Because here's the thing about Viking slavery that's often overlooked. It wasn't just an economic system, it was a social necessity. Free Vikings defined themselves partly by what they weren't. They weren't thralls. Their identity as a free people was reinforced daily by the presence of those who had no freedom at all. Your degradation was essential to their sense of superiority. This meant that even kind masters, and there were some, still participated in a system designed to dehumanize you. They might feed you better or work you less harshly, but they still owned you. They still had the legal right to sell you, beat you, or kill you. Kindness from a master was never a right. It was a privilege that could be revoked at any moment. And speaking of rights, let's talk about what happened when thralls tried to assert any semblance of human dignity. Because resistance, when it occurred, was met with responses so vicious, they served as object lessons for every other slave in the community. Physical punishment for thralls wasn't just about maintaining discipline. It was about sending a message. A thrall who stole food might have their hand cut off. One who tried to escape could be hamstrung, deliberately crippled to prevent future attempts. Sexual assault of female thralls wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Their bodies belonged to their masters, and consent wasn't a concept that applied to property. But the most insidious aspect of thrall punishment was how it turned other slaves into accomplices. Masters would often force thralls to participate in punishing their fellow slaves. This created a web of complicity and guilt that made solidarity nearly impossible. How do you trust someone who was forced to hold you down while you were beaten? How do you build resistance when the system has turned everyone into both victim and victimizer? The psychological trauma was intentional and systematic. Vikings understood that broken people were easier to control than merely restrained ones. They didn't just want your labor, they wanted your spirit crushed so completely that the thought of freedom would seem foreign, almost blasphemous. This is why escape attempts were so rare and so rarely successful. It wasn't just the physical barriers, though those were formidable. It was the psychological conditioning that convinced many thralls that they deserved their fate, that this was the natural order of things, that they were inherently inferior beings who had no right to freedom. And for those who did maintain some spark of resistance, some flicker of hope, the Vikings had developed methods of extinguishing it that were both cruel and effective. Public humiliation, family separation, the constant threat of sale to even worse masters. Every aspect of thrall life was designed to remind you that you were nothing, that you had always been nothing. and that you would die as nothing. But we're just getting started. Because the daily horror of being a thrall was only part of the nightmare. Wait until you learn about the religious aspects of Viking slavery, where your suffering was literally sanctified by their gods. Where being sacrificed wasn't just a possibility, it was considered an honor you didn't deserve. The religious dimension of Viking slavery adds a layer of horror that's almost incomprehensible to modern minds. Because in Norse society, your enslavement wasn't just justified by might makes right, it was sanctified by the gods themselves. You weren't just property, you were religiously designated as inferior, cosmically ordained to serve your betters until the day you died. Let's start with the mythology that underpinned this system. According to Norse creation stories, the social order wasn't man-made, it was divine. The god Heimdall had walked the earth and created 3 classes of people: thralls, farmers, and nobles, each born to their station, each locked into their destiny by the will of the gods. Your slavery wasn't an accident of war or economics. It was your fundamental nature, written into the fabric of reality itself. This religious framework meant that resistance wasn't just futile, it was blasphemous. To rebel against your master was to rebel against the gods who had ordained your servitude. To seek freedom was to violate the cosmic order that kept the world functioning. Your chains weren't just physical restraints. They were sacred bonds blessed by divine authority, but the religious horror went deeper than just ideological justification. Viking religious practices actively required slave participation in ways that would traumatize you beyond imagination. During major festivals like the Winter Nights or the Great Sacrifice at Uppsala, thralls weren't just witnesses to religious ceremonies. They were integral parts of them. Living religious objects to be used, abused, and discarded for the spiritual benefit of their masters. Consider the seasonal sacrifices that marked the Viking religious calendar. These weren't symbolic rituals. They were mass slaughters designed to appease the gods and ensure prosperity for the community. And guess who provided the bulk of the sacrificial offerings? Not the free farmers who could barely spare a chicken. Not the nobles who valued their livestock. It was thralls who filled the ritual-killing fields, their blood watering the sacred groves while their masters watched approvingly. The selection process for sacrifice was particularly cruel because it was presented as an honor. Masters would choose their most beautiful, most skilled, or sometimes their most troublesome thralls for the altar. If you were selected, you were told you should be grateful, that your death would please the gods and bring prosperity to the community, that your worthless life was finally gaining meaning through its ending. But here's what made it even more psychologically devastating. Other thralls were often forced to participate in preparing you for sacrifice. They'd bathe you, dress you in ceremonial garments, and escort you to the temple. Your fellow slaves became unwilling accomplices in your ritual murder, creating trauma that would haunt the survivors for years. The actual sacrificial ceremonies were designed to maximize both religious impact and psychological terror. You might be hanged from the sacred tree, left to strangle slowly while priests chanted and crowds cheered. You could be drowned in the holy well, your lungs filling with sacred water while you fought desperately for air that would never come. Or you might be burned alive in the temple fire, your screams mixing with the smoke that carried prayers to the gods. Some sacrifices were even more elaborate. During the great festivals, thralls might be subjected to ritual torture that lasted for days. Slow dismemberment, gradual flaying, systematic mutilation, all performed with religious precision, while crowds of free Vikings watched and celebrated. Your agony wasn't just entertainment, it was worship. Your pain was literally sacred, a gift to gods who demanded suffering from the lowest members of society. And if you somehow survived these festivals, if you weren't chosen for sacrifice this time, you lived with the knowledge that next year might be different. that any day your master might decide your life was worth more as an offering than as labor. The constant threat of religious murder hung over every thrall like a sword suspended by a thread. But the religious dimension of slavery extended beyond just sacrificial ceremonies. Viking funeral practices regularly included the murder of thralls to serve their masters in the afterlife. When a wealthy Viking died, they didn't journey to Valhalla alone. They took their property with them, including their human property. The most detailed account we have comes from the Arab trader Ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a Viking ship burial on the Volga River. A female thrall was selected to accompany her dead master to the afterlife. She was given alcohol to dull her senses, then systematically passed among the dead man's companions before being strangled and stabbed to death on the funeral pyre. Her murder was described as a religious duty, a necessary part of ensuring the dead man's comfort in the next world. This practice wasn't rare or exceptional. Archaeological evidence suggests that thrall sacrifice at funerals was common throughout the Viking world. Graves across Scandinavia contain the remains of slaves buried alongside their masters, often showing clear signs of violent death. These weren't people who died naturally and were honored with burial alongside their betters. These were murder victims, killed specifically to serve as eternal slaves in whatever realm awaited beyond death. The religious justification for these murders was that thralls had no souls of their own worth preserving. They existed only to serve, and death didn't change that fundamental relationship. Your master owned you in life, and the gods ensured he would own you in death as well. There was no escape, no freedom, no relief, even in the grave. Think about the psychological impact of living with this knowledge. Every day you woke up knowing that your master's death might trigger your own murder, that your life could end not because of anything you'd done, but simply because someone you were forced to serve had died and needed company in the afterlife. You couldn't even take comfort in the idea that death might free you from bondage. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Viking religious slavery was how it corrupted even the concept of divine justice. In most religious systems, the gods are portrayed as ultimately fair, as cosmic forces that balance the scales of justice even if human society fails to do so. The Norse gods were different. They actively endorsed and participated in the oppression of thralls. Odin, the All-Father, was said to own thralls in Valhalla who served the fallen warriors. Freya, god of prosperity, accepted thrall sacrifices to ensure good harvests. Even Frigg, associated with motherhood and domestic life, was served by thrall women who had no choice in their devotion. The entire Norse pantheon was complicit in a system that treated human beings as disposable objects. This meant that you couldn't even find comfort in prayer or spiritual practice. The very gods that your masters worshipped were the same deities that had ordained your enslavement. There was no divine court of appeal, no cosmic justice waiting to balance the scales. The universe itself, according to Viking theology, was structured to ensure your permanent subjugation. And yet, despite all this religious conditioning, despite the constant reinforcement that your slavery was divinely ordained and cosmically necessary, some thralls still found ways to resist. Not through open rebellion, which was suicide, but through subtle forms of spiritual resistance that the masters never suspected. Some thralls clung secretly to their original religious beliefs, whispering prayers to gods their captors had never heard of. Others developed syncretic practices that blended Norse mythology with their own spiritual traditions, creating hybrid belief systems that offered some small comfort in a world designed to crush their spirits. A few even found ways to turn Viking religious practices against their oppressors, using their knowledge of Norse ritual to curse their masters or protect their fellow slaves. But these small acts of spiritual resistance were dangerous beyond imagination. Discovery meant not just punishment, but accusations of witchcraft or heresy that could result in torture and death that made ordinary beatings look merciful. The Vikings took their religious practices seriously, and slaves who tampered with sacred matters faced retribution that was both immediate and eternal. Because that's the thing about religious slavery that made it so much worse than simple economic bondage. It wasn't just your body that was enslaved, it was your soul. The Vikings had created a system where your spiritual essence, your very relationship with the divine, was controlled and corrupted by your masters. They didn't just own your labor, they owned your connection to whatever gods might exist, whatever afterlife might await, whatever meaning your existence might have. This spiritual dimension is why Viking slavery was so particularly devastating to its victims. Physical chains can be broken. Economic systems can change. But when your enslavement is written into the fundamental structure of reality itself, when the gods themselves are complicit in your oppression, resistance becomes not just difficult, but seemingly pointless. And we haven't even talked about what happened to the children born into this system. Because thrall children weren't just slaves. They were slaves who had never known freedom, who couldn't even imagine what liberty might look like. They were born into bondage so complete, so total, that they often became the most effective enforcers of their own oppression. But that's a horror story for the next part of our journey into the nightmare of Viking slavery. Because if you think what we've covered so far is bad, wait until you learn about the systematic destruction of families, the breeding programs designed to produce better slaves, and the special cruelties reserved for children who had the misfortune to be born into bondage. The children born into thrall families faced a horror that even adult slaves could barely comprehend. At least captured adults had memories of freedom, however brief or distant. They knew what it felt like to make choices, to own their own time, to wake up without immediately checking their master's mood. But thrall children? They were born into a world where slavery wasn't an injustice visited upon them. It was simply the natural order of things. From the moment they could walk, these children were trained not just to work, but to internalize their own worthlessness. They learned to flinch before they learned to speak. They mastered submission before they could tie their own shoes. Their earliest memories weren't of play or exploration, but of watching their parents beaten for the smallest infractions and understanding that this was their future too. The psychological conditioning began in infancy. Thrall babies who cried too much might be taken from their mothers and disposed of. Those who survived learned quickly that their needs meant nothing, that their comfort was irrelevant, that their very existence was contingent on their usefulness to their masters. By age 3 or 4, these children were already performing simple tasks: feeding chickens, carrying water, sorting grain. Child labor wasn't just accepted, it was expected. But here's where the system became truly diabolical. Viking masters understood that children born into slavery could be shaped more completely than captured adults. These young thralls had no competing loyalties, no memories of freedom to inspire resistance. They could be molded into perfect slaves, humans who would police themselves and their fellow thralls more effectively than any overseer. The training was systematic and brutal. Children who showed any spark of independence were broken quickly and publicly. Those who displayed intelligence were either killed as potential troublemakers or carefully channeled into roles where their cleverness served their master's interests. The Vikings had learned that smart slaves were useful, but smart slaves who remembered their humanity were dangerous. Family bonds among thralls were deliberately undermined from birth. Children might be separated from their parents at any time, sold to different masters, or simply moved to different parts of the household to prevent emotional attachments from forming. Mothers were forced to watch their children beaten and couldn't intervene. Fathers had to stand by helplessly as their daughters were sexually abused by their masters. The family unit, that basic source of human resilience and identity, was systematically destroyed. This separation wasn't just cruel, it was strategic. Vikings understood that people who loved each other might take risks to protect one another, A mother might rebel to save her child. A father might attempt escape to rescue his family. But isolated individuals, cut off from emotional support, were far less likely to resist. Loneliness was a tool of control as effective as any chain. The breeding of thralls was managed like livestock husbandry. Masters would select which slaves could reproduce, often choosing for physical strength, docility, or useful skills. Viking law treated thrall children as property from the moment of conception. They belonged to the mother's master, not to their parents, and could be disposed of at will. Some masters even experimented with selective breeding programs, trying to create bloodlines of thralls with specific characteristics. Particularly strong slaves might be bred to produce laborers. Attractive thralls were paired to create more beautiful slaves for domestic service. Intelligence was sometimes encouraged, but only when coupled with absolute submission. The goal was to produce better human tools, not better human beings. The sexual exploitation of thrall children was accepted as normal and natural. Young girls were often used by their masters from the moment they reached puberty, sometimes earlier. Boys weren't safe either. The concept of consent didn't apply to property, and thrall children learned early that their bodies belonged to whoever owned them. This abuse wasn't hidden or shameful. It was open and acknowledged as one of the privileges of ownership. For these children, there was no concept of childhood as we understand it. No playtime, no protection from adult concerns, no gradual introduction to responsibility. They were miniature adults from the moment they could be useful, and they were discarded the moment they couldn't be. A sick thrall child was often left to die, rather than waste resources on medical care. A disabled child might be killed outright or abandoned in the wilderness. Education for thrall children was limited to whatever skills their masters found useful. They might learn to read if their owner needed scribes, or master complex crafts if those abilities added to their value. But they were never taught to think critically, to question authority, or to imagine alternatives to their current situation. Knowledge was power, and power was reserved for free people. The psychological damage inflicted on these children was profound and lasting. They grew up believing that their suffering was natural and inevitable, that free people were inherently superior and deserved their comfortable lives, that resistance was not just futile but morally wrong. Many thrall children became more effective at enforcing the system of slavery than their masters were, because they had been so thoroughly convinced of their own inferiority. This internalized oppression created a caste system that was nearly impossible to break. Adult thralls, who had been born into slavery, often became the harshest overseers of newly captured slaves. They had survived by accepting their worthlessness so completely that they couldn't tolerate anyone who still maintained dignity or hope. Former victims became willing accomplices in perpetuating the cycle of abuse. The few thrall children who somehow maintained any sense of self-worth faced a particularly cruel fate. They were identified early as potential troublemakers and subjected to special conditioning designed to break them completely. This might involve public humiliation, extreme physical punishment, or psychological torture that targeted whatever small sense of identity they had managed to preserve. Some were deliberately traumatized in ways calculated to destroy their ability to form human connections. They might be forced to participate in punishing other thralls, including family members. They could be made to choose between their own suffering and that of loved ones, creating guilt and shame that would cripple them for life. The goal was to make them complicit in their own oppression and that of their fellow slaves. The religious indoctrination of thrall children was particularly insidious. They were taught that their enslavement was not just socially acceptable, but divinely ordained, that the gods themselves had decreed their inferior status, and that accepting their fate was a form of worship. Rebellion wasn't just punished by their masters, it was condemned by the universe itself. These children learned to pray for their master's prosperity and to thank the gods for the privilege of serving their betters. They were taught that their suffering was meaningful only insofar as it benefited free people. Their pain had no intrinsic value, their joy was irrelevant, and their deaths mattered only if they inconvenienced their owners. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of thrall childhood was how it corrupted the very concept of hope. Adult slaves might dream of escape or freedom, however unrealistic those dreams might be. Children born into slavery often couldn't even imagine what freedom would look like. They had no frame of reference for a life without masters, no vocabulary for describing human dignity, no mental models for self-determination. When these children did dare to dream, their fantasies were often limited to becoming better slaves, maybe earning their master's approval, or being sold to a kinder owner, or simply surviving another day without punishment. The idea that they might have inherent worth as human beings, that they might deserve happiness or respect or love, was so foreign to their experience that it literally couldn't occur to them. This is why the children of thralls often became the most effective enforcers of the slavery system. They had been so thoroughly broken, so completely convinced of their own worthlessness, that they genuinely believed their masters were superior beings who deserved to be served. They policed other slaves not out of malice, but out of sincere conviction that maintaining the social order was morally correct. The Vikings had created the perfect slave caste, humans who would perpetuate their own oppression across generations without requiring constant supervision or control. These children grew up to be adults who would teach their own children to accept slavery as natural and inevitable. The system became self-sustaining, powered by the victims themselves. And yet, despite all this conditioning, despite the systematic destruction of their humanity from birth, some thrall children still found ways to resist, not through open rebellion, which was impossible, but through tiny acts of defiance that preserved some spark of human dignity. A shared glance of understanding with another slave, a moment of kindness shown to someone even more helpless, a small lie told to protect a friend from punishment. These acts of resistance were dangerous beyond measure. Discovery could mean torture or death. But they happened anyway, because even in the most dehumanizing circumstances, some essential part of the human spirit refused to be completely extinguished. Children who had never known freedom still somehow understood that what was being done to them was wrong, even if they couldn't articulate why or imagine alternatives. The tragedy is that these sparks of resistance were usually snuffed out quickly. The system was too comprehensive, too total, too effective at identifying and crushing any sign of independent thought or feeling. Most thrall children who showed any hint of rebellion were broken so thoroughly that they never recovered their sense of self-worth. But the fact that resistance existed at all, that children born into the most complete form of slavery ever devised still somehow knew they were being wronged, speaks to something indestructible in human nature, something that even the Vikings, for all their systematic cruelty, could never quite eliminate. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of Viking slavery, the economic engine that made it all possible. Because thrall labor wasn't just a byproduct of raiding and warfare, it was the foundation of Viking prosperity, the hidden engine that powered their expansion across Europe and beyond. Without slaves, the Viking Age as we know it simply couldn't have existed. Every successful Viking household depended on thrall labor for its basic functioning. While free Vikings were off raiding, trading, or fighting, it was slaves who maintained the farms, crafted the goods, and performed the countless daily tasks that kept society running. The legendary Viking longships were built by thrall hands. The weapons that conquered half of Europe were forged by slavesmiths. Even the food that sustained Viking armies was grown and prepared by people who would never taste freedom. The scale of this slave economy was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that thralls made up between 20 and 30% of the population in most Viking territories. In some regions, particularly those heavily involved in the slave trade, the percentage was even higher. We're talking about millions of human beings reduced to property over the course of the Viking Age. But numbers alone don't capture the economic reality. Thralls weren't just numerous, they were valuable. A healthy adult slave could cost as much as 8 cows or 3 years' worth of butter. skilled craftsmen brought even higher prices. Children, despite their limited immediate usefulness, were prized for their potential and their malleability. The slave trade generated enormous wealth for Viking raiders and merchants. This wealth wasn't just individual profit. It funded the expansion of Viking civilization across the known world. The silver that paid for expeditions to Iceland, Greenland, and North America often came from slave sales in Constantinople or Cordoba. The resources that built the great trading centers of Hedeby and Birka were generated partly by human trafficking. The Viking Age was literally built on the backs of enslaved people. The international slave trade connected Viking territories to markets across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. Scandinavian slaves were prized in the Byzantine Empire for their strength and fair complexions. Arab merchants paid premium prices for Nordic thralls to serve in harems and households across the Islamic world. The demand was so high that it drove a continuous cycle of raiding and capture that lasted for centuries. But the economic impact went beyond just the immediate profits from slave sales. Thrall labor allowed free Vikings to specialize in activities that generated even more wealth. While slaves handled basic production and maintenance, free men could focus on raiding, trading, craftsmanship, and warfare. This division of labor created a competitive advantage that helped Viking societies outcompete their neighbors. The irony is that this slave-based economy ultimately contributed to the end of the Viking Age itself. As European societies developed more effective defenses against raiding, as Christianity spread and organized resistance to slave-taking, as alternative sources of wealth emerged through legitimate trade, the economic foundation of Viking power began to erode. The very success of their slave economy created conditions that made it unsustainable in the long term. But that economic collapse was still centuries away from our thralls' daily reality. For them, the grand historical forces were irrelevant. What mattered was surviving another day in a system designed to extract every ounce of value from their bodies while crushing every spark of humanity from their souls. And that survival required a kind of psychological endurance that defies modern comprehension. Now let's talk about what it really meant to endure this system day after day, year after year, until your body gave out or your mind finally snapped. Because survival as a thrall wasn't just about avoiding immediate death. It was about navigating a psychological minefield where every interaction could determine whether you lived to see another sunrise. The hierarchy among thralls was deliberately complex and constantly shifting. Vikings understood that slaves who spent their energy competing with each other had less energy for resisting their masters. So they created elaborate systems of privilege and punishment that turned thralls against one another. The house slave who served at table looked down on the field worker who hauled stones. The skilled craftsman who made tools felt superior to the kitchen slave who cleaned pots. Everyone needed someone beneath them to maintain their sanity. But here's the twisted brilliance of this system. Those tiny privileges, those microscopic improvements in status, became more precious than gold to people who had nothing. A thrall might work for years to earn the right to sleep indoors instead of in the barn. They'd betray fellow slaves for the chance to eat scraps from their master's table, instead of the pig slop reserved for field hands. The system turned victims into willing participants in their own oppression. The psychological warfare was constant and exhausting. Masters would deliberately create situations where thralls had to choose between their own welfare and that of their fellow slaves. Maybe there was only enough food for half the thralls, forcing them to compete for survival. Perhaps punishment could be avoided by informing on another slave's minor transgression. These impossible choices created guilt, shame, and mistrust that made solidarity nearly impossible. Sleep became a luxury that most thralls rarely enjoyed, not just because of the physical discomfort of sleeping on cold floors or in drafty barns, but because of the constant anxiety that permeated every moment of rest. You never knew when you might be awakened for punishment, for extra work, or simply because your master was drunk and wanted entertainment. Many thralls developed chronic insomnia that lasted for years, their bodies too traumatized to fully relax even in exhaustion. The seasonal cycles that governed free Viking life became instruments of torture for slaves. Winter meant being trapped indoors with your oppressors for months, breathing their stale air, enduring their moods, unable to escape even for a moment of solitude. Spring brought the terror of raiding season, when you might be sold to finance expeditions or simply murdered to reduce the household's expenses. Summer meant backbreaking labor under the midnight sun, working 18-hour days with no relief from the heat or the endless light. But perhaps the most soul-crushing aspect of thrall life was the complete absence of privacy or personal space. You owned nothing, not even your own thoughts. Masters felt entitled to know everything about their slaves' inner lives. They'd interrogate you about your dreams, your fears, your memories of freedom. They'd force you to confess emotions you'd rather keep hidden, then use those confessions against you later. Your body wasn't your own in any sense. Masters would examine you regularly, not just for signs of illness or injury that might affect your work capacity, but simply because they could. They'd comment on your appearance, your smell, your physical development. Female thralls were subjected to regular inspections to determine if they were pregnant, menstruating, or suitable for breeding. Male thralls might be examined for signs of sexual activity or rebellion. Nothing was sacred. Nothing was private. The constant surveillance extended to your relationships with other thralls. Masters discouraged friendships because they knew that emotional bonds could lead to resistance. If you showed affection for another slave, they might be sold or punished just to cause you pain. If you tried to comfort someone who was suffering, you risked being accused of plotting rebellion. Even basic human kindness became dangerous. Language itself was weaponized against thralls. You weren't allowed to speak your native tongue, especially around other slaves who might share it. Your birth name was erased and replaced with whatever designation your master found convenient. Often these names were deliberately humiliating. Dung carrier, rat face, clumsy hands. Every time someone spoke to you, you were reminded of your worthlessness. The corruption of language went deeper than just names. Thralls were forced to adopt a special vocabulary that reinforced their inferior status. You couldn't say, "I need food." You had to say, "This slave requests feeding." You couldn't express pain or exhaustion directly. Instead, you had to frame your suffering in terms of how it might affect your usefulness to your master. The very words you were allowed to use stripped away your humanity sentence by sentence. Medical care for thralls was purely economic calculation. If fixing you cost less than replacing you, you might receive treatment. Otherwise, you were left to heal on your own or die trying. Broken bones were set only if they affected your work capacity. Infections were treated only if they might spread to valuable livestock or free people. Chronic pain was ignored completely unless it made you visibly less productive. Mental health wasn't even a concept that applied to slaves. Depression, anxiety, trauma responses, these were all seen as character flaws rather than understandable reactions to impossible circumstances. A thrall who couldn't stop crying might be beaten for disrupting the household's peace. One who withdrew into silence could be punished for sullenness. There was no acceptable way to process the psychological damage being inflicted on you daily. The few moments of relative peace that thralls managed to steal were precious beyond description. Maybe a few minutes alone while fetching water from the well. Perhaps a shared glance of understanding with a fellow slave during a beating. Sometimes, just the sensation of sunlight on your face during a brief walk between buildings. These tiny fragments of humanity had to sustain you through weeks of degradation and abuse. Some thralls developed elaborate fantasy lives as a survival mechanism. They'd create detailed mental worlds where they were free, where they had families who loved them, where their actions had meaning beyond serving their masters. These fantasies could be dangerous if they showed on your face at the wrong moment, but they were often the only thing that kept complete despair at bay. Others found salvation in religion, though not the Norse beliefs of their masters. Secret prayers to half-remembered gods from their homeland, quiet rituals performed in hidden moments, the desperate hope that somewhere, some divine force was keeping track of the injustices being done and would eventually balance the scales. Faith became both a comfort and a risk, because discovery could mean accusations of witchcraft or heretical practice. The physical deterioration was relentless and predictable. Poor food, constant stress, inadequate shelter, and brutal working conditions aged thralls rapidly. A 20-year-old slave often looked 40. A 30-year-old was ancient by thrall standards. The combination of malnutrition and overwork created bodies that were simultaneously tough and fragile, capable of enduring enormous abuse, but vulnerable to any additional stress. Scars accumulated like a living history of your enslavement. Whip marks across your back from punishment. Burn scars from kitchen accidents that couldn't be properly treated. Missing fingers from unsafe working conditions. Rope burns on your wrists and ankles from restraints. Each mark told a story of survival, but also of degradation. Your body became a map of every cruelty you'd endured. The smell of slavery was distinctive and inescapable. Unwashed bodies, infected wounds, fear sweat, and the particular odor of people who had given up hope created an atmosphere that clung to thrall quarters like a physical presence. Free Vikings could identify slaves by scent alone, another marker of the vast gulf that separated the owned from the owners. Hygiene was a privilege reserved for free people. Thralls might wash if their work required it, but personal cleanliness was considered vanity inappropriate for property. You learned to live with layers of grime, with lice and fleas as constant companions, with the shame of knowing that your appearance marked you as subhuman to anyone who saw you. The seasonal clothing changes that helped free Vikings survive the harsh Scandinavian climate were largely denied to slaves. You wore the same rough garments year-round, adding or removing layers as weather demanded, but never having clothes that actually fit properly or provided adequate protection. Frostbite in winter and heat exhaustion in summer were occupational hazards that masters accepted as normal costs of slave ownership. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of long-term enslavement was how it changed your relationship with hope itself. New thralls often maintained fierce determination to escape or resist. They'd plan elaborate schemes, look for opportunities, maintain their sense of dignity through sheer force of will. But years of systematic brutality wore down even the strongest spirits. Veteran thralls learned a different kind of survival. They stopped planning escapes because the consequences of failure were too horrific to risk. They stopped maintaining their dignity because dignity was a luxury that could get you killed. They stopped hoping for freedom because hope itself had become a source of additional suffering. Instead, they developed a kind of protective numbness that allowed them to function without feeling. This emotional shutdown was both a survival mechanism and a tragedy. It allowed thralls to endure conditions that would have driven them insane otherwise. But it also meant that even if freedom somehow became possible, many long-term slaves were too damaged to recognize or pursue it. They had been so thoroughly broken that they couldn't imagine any existence other than slavery. The Vikings had created something unprecedented in human history. Not just a system of forced labor, but a comprehensive method for destroying human souls while keeping human bodies functional. They had learned to break people so completely that the victims would maintain the system themselves, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of degradation that could last for generations. And yet, incredibly, some thralls found ways to maintain tiny sparks of humanity Even in these impossible circumstances, they developed secret languages for communicating hope. They created hidden rituals for honoring their dead. They found ways to show kindness to fellow slaves without attracting attention. These acts of resistance were microscopic and largely invisible, but they represented something that even the most sophisticated slavery system couldn't completely eliminate. The human spirit, it turned out, was more resilient than even the Vikings had imagined. Not strong enough to break free from physical bondage, but tough enough to preserve small fragments of dignity and compassion in the darkest possible circumstances. These fragments would prove important in ways that no one could have predicted, because the Viking slave system, for all its efficiency and brutality, contained the seeds of its own eventual destruction. But before we explore how this nightmare finally ended, we need to understand just how deeply slavery was woven into every aspect of Viking culture. Because thralls weren't just an economic resource or a source of labor, they were the foundation upon which the entire Viking way of life was built. And when that foundation finally cracked, it would bring down more than just the slave system. It would transform Scandinavian society in ways that are still visible today. The economic threads of slavery were so deeply woven into Viking society that pulling them out would have caused the entire fabric to unravel. Think about it this way. Every magnificent longship that carried Vikings to distant shores was built using slave labor. Every intricate piece of jewelry that adorned a jarl's wife was crafted by thrall hands. Every sword that carved out new territories was forged in workshops powered by human property. The wealth generated by the slave trade didn't just line individual pockets. It funded the entire Viking expansion across Europe and beyond. When Vikings established trading posts in Dublin, Kiev, or Constantinople, they weren't just selling amber and furs. They were trafficking human beings on an industrial scale. The silver that flowed back into Scandinavian coffers came largely from slave auctions in distant markets. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. The Vikings had turned slavery into a renewable resource. Unlike gold mines that eventually run dry or trade routes that might be disrupted, the supply of human slaves seemed inexhaustible. Every successful raid brought fresh captives. Every conquest opened new hunting grounds for human prey. The business model was sustainable as long as there were weaker societies to exploit. The international slave markets that Vikings helped create stretched from Greenland to the Black Sea. In Constantinople, blonde Scandinavian slaves commanded premium prices in Byzantine harems. In Cordoba, fair-skinned thralls were prized as exotic servants in Moorish palaces. The demand was so consistent that Viking raiders could plan their expeditions around market prices, timing their attacks for maximum profit. This wasn't casual opportunism. It was sophisticated international commerce. Viking merchants maintained detailed knowledge of which types of slaves were in demand where. They knew that eunuchs brought higher prices in certain markets, so they developed efficient castration procedures that maximized survival rates. They understood that trained craftsmen were worth more than raw laborers, so they invested in teaching valuable skills to promising thralls before sale. The logistics of moving thousands of human beings across vast distances required extraordinary organization. Viking slave traders developed specialized ships designed for human cargo. They established supply lines for feeding captives during long journeys. They created holding facilities at major ports where slaves could be processed, sorted, and prepared for different markets. But the true genius of the Viking slave economy was how it integrated with their broader cultural values. Raiding wasn't just about wealth accumulation. It was about proving your worth as a warrior, gaining honor for your family, and securing your place in Valhalla. The fact that these raids also generated enormous profits from slave sales made them even more attractive to ambitious young Vikings. This created a feedback loop that accelerated Viking expansion. Successful raids brought both glory and slaves. Slaves generated wealth that could fund larger raids. Larger raids brought more slaves and more glory. The system was self-reinforcing, driving Vikings to push ever further from their homeland in search of new sources of human cargo. The cultural impact went beyond just economics. Viking art, literature, and lore all reflected a society built on slave labor. Their sagas celebrated heroes who captured hundreds of thralls in single raids. Their legal codes specified detailed regulations for slave ownership, breeding, and punishment. Their religious practices incorporated slave sacrifice as routine elements of major festivals. Even Viking concepts of masculinity and femininity were shaped by the presence of slaves. A real man owned thralls and used them however he saw fit. A proper woman managed her household slaves efficiently and without sentiment. Children learned these values from birth, growing up in homes where human property was as normal as livestock or furniture. The psychological effects on free Vikings were profound and often overlooked. Living in constant proximity to human suffering created a kind of moral numbness that extended beyond just slave-related activities. Vikings became comfortable with casual cruelty, with the idea that some people's pain simply didn't matter. This callousness made them more effective raiders and warriors, but it also fundamentally altered their humanity. Free Viking women occupied a particularly complex position in this system. On one hand, they had more rights and freedoms than women in many other medieval societies. They could own property, request divorces, and participate in business dealings. But these privileges were built on the backs of enslaved women who had no rights at all. The freedom of Viking women was purchased with the bondage of their thralls. This created a strange dynamic where Viking women could be simultaneously empowered and complicit in oppression. They might manage extensive business operations that included slave trading. They could inherit thralls as property and dispose of them as they saw fit. Some Viking women became wealthy and influential through their involvement in the slave economy, even as other women suffered unimaginable degradation as thralls. The children of free Vikings grew up accepting this system as natural and inevitable. They played games that involved pretending to capture slaves. They were taught to view thralls as a different species of being, less intelligent and less deserving of consideration than animals. By the time they reached adulthood, the moral foundations for questioning slavery had been completely eroded. This childhood conditioning was so thorough that most free Vikings literally couldn't imagine their society functioning without slaves. The idea of doing their own manual labor, of managing households without thrall servants, of conducting raids purely for glory rather than profit, seemed as foreign as abandoning agriculture or seafaring. Slavery wasn't just an economic system to them, it was reality itself. The legal framework surrounding slavery was elaborate and sophisticated. Viking law codes specified exactly how slaves could be acquired, sold, punished, and disposed of. There were regulations governing the breeding of thralls, the inheritance of slave property, and the resolution of disputes between slave owners. The legal system treated human trafficking as legitimate commerce, requiring careful regulation rather than prohibition. But these laws also revealed the deep anxieties that free Vikings felt about their slave-based society. Extensive regulations governed what weapons thralls could access, where they could travel, and how they could interact with free people. The legal codes were filled with provisions designed to prevent slave rebellions, suggesting that Vikings lived in constant fear of their human property turning against them. This fear was well-founded. Despite the systematic brutality used to control them, thralls occasionally did rebel. These uprisings were typically small, poorly organized, and quickly crushed, but they haunted the Viking imagination. Free Vikings told stories of slave revolts that devastated entire regions, of thralls who murdered their masters in their sleep, of coordinated uprisings that nearly toppled the social order. These fears influenced every aspect of how Vikings managed their slaves. thralls were deliberately kept ignorant of military tactics and weapons handling. They were separated by ethnicity and language to prevent communication and coordination. They were subjected to random searches and interrogations designed to detect any signs of rebellious planning. The paranoia was constant and exhausting for both slaves and masters. The irony is that this paranoia may have been the most effective form of resistance that thralls could mount. Even without actually rebelling, their mere presence as a potentially hostile force within Viking society created stress and anxiety that wore down their oppressors. Free Vikings had to constantly guard against threats from their own property, limiting their freedom and peace of mind. The religious dimension of slavery created additional complications for Viking society. While Norse mythology justified the enslavement of inferior peoples, it also contained elements that could be interpreted as critical of excessive cruelty. Some of the gods were portrayed as protectors of the weak and oppressed. Certain religious festivals emphasized community solidarity that theoretically included all members of society. These contradictions created cognitive dissonance that some Vikings resolved by developing increasingly elaborate justifications for their treatment of slaves. They convinced themselves that thralls were fundamentally different from free people, lacking souls or intelligence, or the capacity for genuine suffering. These rationalizations became more extreme over time, as Vikings tried to reconcile their religious beliefs with their economic practices. But not all Vikings were comfortable with these justifications. Archaeological evidence suggests that some free Vikings treated their slaves with a relative kindness, providing better food, shelter, and working conditions than the law required. A few may have even freed their thralls voluntarily, though this was extremely rare and often met with social disapproval from other slave owners. These acts of individual compassion didn't fundamentally challenge the system of slavery, but they did create cracks in the ideological foundation that supported it. When some Vikings began treating thralls as human beings worthy of consideration, it became harder to maintain the fiction that all slaves were naturally inferior. These small acts of humanity planted seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into broader questioning of the entire system. The economic dependencies created by slave labor also made Viking society surprisingly fragile. When external pressures began to disrupt the slave trade, the effects rippled through every aspect of Scandinavian life. Reduced access to new slaves meant higher prices for existing thralls. Higher prices made slave ownership less profitable. Less profitable slavery meant reduced funding for the raids that brought new captives. The cycle that had driven Viking expansion for centuries began to reverse. Christian missionary activity posed another threat to the slave system. While early Christianity didn't explicitly condemn slavery, it did emphasize the spiritual equality of all human beings. When Vikings began converting to Christianity, some found it difficult to reconcile their new faith with their ownership of human property. The cognitive dissonance was manageable for a while, but it created internal pressure for change. The consolidation of European kingdoms also made slave raiding increasingly difficult and dangerous. As potential victims organized better defenses and developed more effective military responses, the cost of acquiring new slaves began to exceed the profits they generated. Viking raiders found themselves facing professional armies rather than defenseless villages, making human trafficking a much riskier business proposition. But perhaps the most significant threat to Viking slavery came from an unexpected source: the slaves themselves. Not through dramatic rebellions or violent uprisings, but through the slow accumulation of cultural knowledge and adaptation that made them less foreign and more recognizably human to their captors. As thralls learned Norse customs, adopted Viking religious practices, and integrated into Scandinavian society, the boundaries between slave and free became increasingly blurred. Some thralls became so valuable to their masters that they were granted significant autonomy and responsibility. A few were even allowed to accumulate personal property or establish families. These privileges didn't constitute freedom, but they did create a class of slaves who had something to lose and therefore something to protect. Paradoxically, better treatment made some thralls more invested in the stability of the system that oppressed them. This integration process worked both ways. Vikings who lived in close contact with slaves for years sometimes developed emotional attachments that complicated the master-slave relationship. A thrall who had served faithfully for decades, who had helped raise the master's children or managed critical household functions, became harder to view as mere property. These personal relationships didn't end slavery, but they did humanize it in ways that made the system less sustainable over time. The gradual erosion of the Viking slave system wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was a slow process of economic, cultural, and religious change that played out over several centuries. But the foundation built on human suffering was ultimately too unstable to support the weight of a changing world. When that foundation finally cracked, it brought down not just the slave economy, but much of what we recognize as Viking civilization itself. The end, when it came, wasn't liberation in any meaningful sense for the thralls who lived through it. Most died in bondage, never experiencing freedom. Their children and grandchildren might eventually see the end of formal slavery, but they would carry the psychological and cultural scars of generations of oppression. The trauma inflicted by the Viking slave system didn't disappear when the economic model became unprofitable. It echoed through Scandinavian society for centuries, shaping attitudes about power, hierarchy, and human worth that influenced Nordic culture long after the last thrall was freed. But the story of Viking slavery isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil when that evil is normalized, legalized, and integrated into the basic structures of society. The Vikings weren't uniquely cruel or unusually sadistic. They were human beings who created and maintained a system of oppression because it benefited them economically and reinforced their sense of superiority. The lesson isn't that Vikings were monsters, but that monsters can be made from ordinary people when the right conditions exist, when cruelty becomes profitable, when oppression is legally sanctioned, when suffering is culturally acceptable. Entire societies can lose their moral compass. The Viking slave system succeeded not because Vikings were inherently evil, but because they created institutions that made evil seem normal, necessary, and even virtuous. Understanding this history matters because the dynamics that enabled Viking slavery haven't disappeared from the world. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed free Vikings to view thralls as subhuman property continue to operate in different contexts today. The same economic incentives that drove the slave trade still motivate human trafficking in the modern world. The same cultural conditioning that normalized cruelty in medieval Scandinavia still shapes how we view and treat marginalized people in our own societies. The thralls whose suffering we've explored tonight weren't abstract historical figures. They were real people with names, families, dreams, and hopes that were systematically destroyed by a society that valued profit over humanity. Their voices were silenced, their stories erased, their pain dismissed as irrelevant. But their experience echoes through time, reminding us that the capacity for both cruelty and resistance exists in every human heart. The true horror of Viking slavery wasn't just the physical brutality or the economic exploitation. It was the systematic destruction of human dignity, the deliberate erasure of identity, the careful cultivation of despair. It was a machine designed to transform people into things, souls into property, hope into submission. And for centuries, that machine operated with terrifying efficiency, grinding up millions of lives to fuel the expansion of Viking civilization. But even in that darkness, even in the most complete system of oppression ever devised, the human spirit proved impossible to completely extinguish. Thralls found ways to preserve fragments of their humanity, to show kindness to fellow sufferers, to maintain tiny sparks of hope in circumstances that seemed hopeless. These acts of resistance were small and largely invisible, but they represented something indestructible in human nature. The Vikings succeeded in enslaving bodies, but they never quite managed to enslave souls. And ultimately, that failure to completely break the human spirit may have been what doomed their system from the beginning, because people who remember their humanity, even in slavery, carry within them the seeds of freedom. And those seeds, however deeply buried, however long dormant, eventually find ways to grow. The economic collapse of the Viking slave system didn't happen overnight. It was a slow strangulation that took place over generations, as the very success of their human trafficking empire created conditions that made it impossible to sustain. But for the thralls living through this transition, the end of slavery often brought new horrors that were barely distinguishable from the old ones. As Christian kingdoms across Europe grew stronger and more organized, they began mounting coordinated defenses against Viking raids. What had once been easy pickings, defenseless monasteries and scattered villages, transformed into fortified strongholds, bristling with professional soldiers. The cost of acquiring new slaves through warfare began to exceed the profits they generated in distant markets. Simultaneously, the demand for slaves in traditional markets started to shift. The Byzantine Empire, once a reliable customer for Nordic thralls, began developing alternative sources of labor. The Islamic world, another major buyer of Scandinavian slaves, found new suppliers closer to home. The international market that had made human trafficking so profitable for centuries was slowly contracting. But here's what made the economic transition so brutal for existing thralls. As new slaves became harder to acquire, the value of existing ones should have increased. Instead, many Viking masters decided to extract maximum value from their current human property before the market collapsed entirely. This led to a period of intensified exploitation that was horrific, even by the standards of Viking slavery. Thralls were worked literally to death in a final orgy of profit extraction. Masters who had once calculated the long-term value of keeping slaves healthy now focused on short-term productivity, regardless of the human cost. The life expectancy of thralls, already tragically short, plummeted even further as they were driven beyond the limits of human endurance. Some masters tried to breed their way out of the economic crisis, forcing thralls into intensive reproduction programs designed to create a new generation of slaves before the old system collapsed completely. Female thralls were treated like livestock in the most literal sense, valued solely for their ability to produce future workers. The children born during this period often faced even worse conditions than their parents, as masters had less incentive to invest in long-term care for property that might have no market value. The psychological impact on thralls during this transition was devastating. Those who had somehow maintained hope for eventual freedom watched that hope evaporate as their masters became more desperate and more cruel. The few privileges that some slaves had managed to earn through years of faithful service were stripped away as economic pressures mounted. Even thralls, who had achieved relative comfort, found themselves reduced to the most basic level of subsistence. But the economic pressures also created unexpected opportunities for resistance. As the slave system became less profitable, some masters began neglecting the elaborate security measures that had previously prevented escapes. Guard rotations became irregular. Surveillance grew lax. The paranoid attention to detail that had once made rebellion impossible started to crack under financial strain. A few thralls managed to exploit these weaknesses, though escape remained extraordinarily dangerous and rarely successful. Most who attempted flight were recaptured within days and subjected to punishments so severe they served as deterrents for years. But the mere fact that some slaves were trying to escape, that the possibility existed even theoretically, began to change the psychological dynamic in thrall communities. The religious transformation of Scandinavia added another layer of complexity to the collapse of slavery. As Viking leaders converted to Christianity, They faced increasing pressure from church authorities to moderate their treatment of slaves. The new religion didn't prohibit slavery outright, but it did emphasize concepts like mercy, compassion, and spiritual equality that were difficult to reconcile with the extreme brutality of the thrall system. Some Christian Vikings tried to resolve this contradiction by treating their slaves with marginally more humanity while maintaining the basic structure of ownership. They might provide better food or shelter, allow slaves to attend church services, or refrain from the most extreme forms of physical punishment. These reforms were minimal and often cosmetic, but they did represent a crack in the ideological foundation that had supported centuries of dehumanization. Other Christian converts took a different approach, convincing themselves that slavery was actually beneficial for thralls because it exposed them to Christian teaching and the possibility of salvation. This paternalistic justification allowed them to maintain their economic interests while feeling virtuous about their treatment of human property. It was a rationalization that would echo through centuries of later slavery systems across the world. The conversion process also created practical problems for slave management. Christian holy days disrupted work schedules. Church attendance requirements meant less labor time. The emphasis on charity and care for the poor sometimes extended to include better treatment of thralls. These changes were gradual and often resisted by masters who saw them as threats to profitability, but they accumulated over time into significant modifications of the slave system. Meanwhile, the political consolidation of European kingdoms was making the Viking way of life increasingly obsolete. The small, decentralized societies that had been easy targets for slave raids were being absorbed into larger, more powerful states with professional armies and sophisticated defenses. The geographic frontiers that had provided fresh hunting grounds for human prey were disappearing as political boundaries stabilized. The Vikings themselves were being absorbed into this new political order. As Scandinavian kingdoms centralized and adopted European models of governance, the independent jarls and petty kings, who had been the backbone of the slave trade, found their power constrained by royal authority. The decentralized raiding culture that had made slavery so profitable was being replaced by more centralized state-controlled forms of warfare. This political transformation had profound implications for thralls. Under the old system, their fate had depended entirely on the whims of individual masters. Under the new centralized monarchies, slave ownership became subject to royal regulation and oversight. Kings who were trying to establish diplomatic relationships with Christian neighbors found the extreme brutality of traditional thrall management to be a diplomatic liability. Some Scandinavian rulers began issuing laws that technically protected slaves from the worst abuses, though enforcement was sporadic and often ignored. These legal changes were motivated more by political necessity than humanitarian concern, but they did create a framework that gradually limited the absolute power that masters had previously exercised over their human property. The economic alternatives to slave labor were also becoming more attractive. As trade networks expanded and became more sophisticated, free wage labor began to compete with slave labor in certain industries. Skilled craftsmen who could choose their employers often produced higher quality goods than slaves who worked under compulsion. The flexibility of free labor markets made them more responsive to changing economic conditions than the rigid structure of slave-based production. Some progressive Viking merchants began experimenting with hybrid systems that combined elements of slavery and wage labor. Thralls might be allowed to earn small payments for extra work, or given the opportunity to purchase their freedom over time. These arrangements were still exploitative and heavily weighted in favor of the masters, but they did represent a departure from the absolute property relationship that had characterized traditional slavery. The technological changes that were transforming European agriculture also reduced the demand for massive amounts of unskilled labor. Improved farming techniques, better tools, and more efficient land management meant that fewer workers were needed to produce the same amount of food. The huge gangs of agricultural slaves that had been essential to Viking prosperity became less economically necessary. But technological progress also created new demands for skilled labor that slaves couldn't easily fulfill. The complex crafts and trades that were becoming central to the medieval economy required training, creativity, and motivation that were difficult to extract from unwilling workers. Free artisans who took pride in their work and competed for customers consistently outperformed slaves who had no incentive for excellence. The urban centers that were growing throughout Europe offered economic opportunities that were incompatible with traditional slavery. Cities needed workers who could move freely, form partnerships, and adapt quickly to changing market conditions. The rigid control required to maintain slaves was difficult to exercise in urban environments, where anonymous movement was easier and alternative employment opportunities existed. These economic pressures created a gradual shift away from slave labor in many industries. But the transition was neither quick nor humanitarian. Masters who could no longer profit from traditional slave arrangements often simply abandoned their human property rather than bearing the cost of manumission or continued support. Elderly or disabled thralls were frequently cast out to starve rather than being cared for in their declining years. The slave markets that had once been central to Viking commerce began to contract and eventually disappear. The great trading centers, like Hedeby and Birka, that had built their prosperity on human trafficking, found themselves struggling to adapt to new economic realities. Some transformed into legitimate commercial hubs, dealing in conventional goods. Others simply declined and were abandoned as trade routes shifted to serve different markets. The international networks that had connected Scandinavian slave traders to markets across Europe and beyond gradually withered as demand decreased and supply became more expensive. The sophisticated logistics systems that had once moved thousands of human beings across vast distances were repurposed for conventional trade or simply allowed to decay. The infrastructure of the slave economy, built over centuries, crumbled in a matter of decades. But perhaps the most significant factor in the collapse of Viking slavery was the changing mentality of the Vikings themselves. As they became more integrated into European Christian culture, as they adopted settled agricultural lifestyles, as they developed alternative sources of wealth and status, the cultural values that had supported slavery began to shift. The warrior ethos that had glorified slave-taking raids was being replaced by Christian ideals of service and devotion. The honor system that had measured worth partly by the number of thralls owned was giving way to new forms of social prestige based on land ownership, commercial success, or religious devotion. The entire worldview that had made slavery seem natural and necessary was being gradually undermined by cultural transformation. This mental shift was particularly pronounced among younger Vikings who had grown up during the transition period. They had been exposed to Christian teaching from childhood, had seen alternative economic models in operation, and had less personal investment in the traditional slave system than their elders. While they didn't necessarily reject slavery on moral grounds, they were more open to economic arrangements that didn't depend on human property. The generational change was accelerated by the practical experience of managing slaves in a changing economic environment. Young Viking lords who inherited thralls from their fathers often discovered that slave labor was less profitable and more troublesome than alternative arrangements. The constant vigilance required to prevent escapes, the overhead costs of feeding and housing unwilling workers, and the diplomatic complications created by extreme brutality made slavery increasingly unattractive to pragmatic managers. Some of these younger lords began experimenting with gradual manumission programs that converted slaves into tenant farmers or wage laborers over time. These transitions were usually structured to benefit the former masters more than the former slaves, but they did represent a departure from the absolute ownership model that had characterized traditional thrall relationships. The women of Viking society also played a role in the transformation of slavery, though their influence was often subtle and indirect. As Christian values spread, Viking women were encouraged to practice charity and mercy as expressions of their faith. Some extended these virtues to include better treatment of household slaves, providing improved food, medical care, or working conditions without fundamentally challenging the ownership relationship. A few Viking women went further, using their legal rights to free slaves through their wills, or to arrange marriages between thralls that their husbands might have prevented. These acts of individual compassion didn't constitute systematic resistance to slavery, but they did create precedents that gradually normalize more humane treatment of human property. The children of Viking families were also influenced by changing cultural values. Those raised in Christian households were taught that all human beings possess souls worthy of salvation, even if they remained legally enslaved. This theological education sometimes created cognitive dissonance when applied to the family's own thralls, leading to questioning that their parents might not have experienced. Some young Vikings who had grown up with particular thralls as playmates or surrogate family members found it difficult to maintain the psychological distance necessary for effective slave management. The personal relationships formed in childhood sometimes evolved into emotional bonds that complicated the master-slave dynamic and made brutal treatment more psychologically difficult. These individual transformations, multiplied across thousands of Viking households over several generations, created a cultural shift that gradually undermined support for the slave system. While most Vikings never explicitly rejected slavery on moral grounds, they became less enthusiastic about its practice and more willing to consider alternatives when economic pressures made change necessary. The collapse of Viking slavery was neither sudden nor complete. In remote areas where traditional values persisted and economic alternatives were limited, forms of bondage continued for centuries after the height of the Viking Age. Some thralls were simply reclassified as serfs or peasants without gaining meaningful freedom. Others found themselves trapped in debt relationships that functioned much like slavery while maintaining the fiction of free status. The legal abolition of slavery in Scandinavian kingdoms came gradually and often incompletely. Laws might prohibit the most extreme forms of abuse while maintaining other aspects of human ownership. Manumission might be encouraged or required in certain circumstances while remaining optional in others. The transition from slave society to free society was messy, partial, and often disappointing for those who had hoped for genuine liberation. For the thralls who lived through this transition, the end of formal slavery was often less liberating than we might imagine. Generations of systematic dehumanization had left deep psychological scars that didn't heal simply because legal status changed. Many former slaves lacked the skills, resources, or confidence necessary to function as free people in a complex economy. Some voluntarily remained with their former masters in arrangements that differed little from their previous bondage. The social stigma attached to slave ancestry persisted long after legal emancipation. Former thralls and their descendants faced discrimination in employment, marriage, and social interaction that limited their opportunities for advancement. The cultural conditioning that had marked them as inferior beings couldn't be erased by legal proclamation. They remained second-class citizens in societies that had theoretically granted them equality. The economic opportunities available to former slaves were often severely limited. Most had been deliberately kept ignorant of skills beyond basic manual labor. They owned no property, had no capital, and lacked the social connections necessary for economic advancement. Many found themselves forced into sharecropping or wage labor arrangements that provided little more security or prosperity than slavery had offered. The psychological trauma inflicted by generations of bondage created lasting problems that affected not just former slaves but their children and grandchildren. The survival strategies that had been necessary under slavery, the emotional numbness, the ingrained habits of submission, the learned helplessness, all proved difficult to overcome even when freedom became possible. Some former thralls struggled with depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems that had no name or treatment in medieval society. Others found themselves unable to form healthy relationships or make independent decisions after lifetimes of having every choice made for them. The freedom they had dreamed of often felt overwhelming and frightening when it finally arrived. The family structures that had been systematically destroyed under slavery proved difficult to rebuild. Former thralls often had no idea what had happened to parents, children, or siblings who had been sold away years earlier. The emotional bonds that might have provided support during the transition to freedom had been severed by the slave system itself. Many former slaves found themselves isolated and alone in a world that offered theoretical freedom but little practical support. The religious and cultural identity of former slaves had also been damaged by their experiences. Many had been forced to abandon their original beliefs and adopt Norse practices, but they had never been fully accepted into Viking religious communities. They existed in a spiritual limbo, cut off from their ancestral traditions, but not truly incorporated into their captors' faith. The spread of Christianity offered some hope for spiritual renewal, but it also required them to embrace the religion of their former oppressors. Despite these challenges, some former thralls did manage to build meaningful lives after emancipation. Those with valuable skills could sometimes establish themselves as independent craftsmen or traders. A few accumulated enough resources to purchase land or start businesses. Others found acceptance in Christian communities that emphasized spiritual equality over social hierarchy. The success stories were rare and often required exceptional determination, intelligence, and luck. But they did exist, serving as proof that the human spirit could survive even the most systematic attempts at destruction. These individuals became role models for other former slaves and helped demonstrate that the supposed inferiority of thralls was a social construction rather than a natural fact. The gradual disappearance of slavery from Scandinavian society didn't eliminate all forms of unfree labor. Serfdom, debt bondage, and other coercive arrangements replaced formal slavery in many contexts. The basic power relationships that had enabled human ownership were often simply reconfigured rather than eliminated. The legal terminology changed, but the fundamental exploitation continued in modified forms. This transformation reflected the adaptability of oppressive systems rather than their defeat. When slavery became economically or politically unsustainable, those who had profited from it found new ways to extract value from vulnerable populations. The end of thraldom marked not the triumph of human dignity, but the evolution of exploitation into forms that were more compatible with changing social and economic conditions. The Viking slave system had lasted for centuries because it served the interests of those with power while systematically destroying the capacity of its victims to resist. Its eventual collapse came not from successful rebellion by thralls, but from changes in the broader economic and cultural environment that made alternative arrangements more profitable for slave owners. The transformation was driven by the needs of oppressors rather than the rights of the oppressed. This pattern would repeat throughout history as slavery systems adapted to changing circumstances rather than disappearing entirely. The basic dynamic of powerful groups exploiting vulnerable populations continued long after the specific institution of Viking thraldom had vanished. The lesson wasn't that humanity had overcome its capacity for cruelty, but that cruelty found new expressions when old ones became obsolete. The memory of Viking slavery was gradually sanitized and romanticized as the actual system disappeared. Later generations of Scandinavians preferred to remember the martial glory and cultural achievements of their ancestors, while forgetting the human suffering that had made those achievements possible. The thralls who had built Viking civilization with their blood and labor were written out of the historical narrative, reduced to footnotes in stories that celebrated their oppressors. This historical amnesia wasn't accidental. It served the interests of later elites who wanted to claim Viking heritage without acknowledging Viking atrocities. The selective memory allowed Scandinavian societies to maintain pride in their past, while avoiding uncomfortable questions about the foundations of their prosperity. The suffering of millions of enslaved people was deemed less important than the reputation of their masters. The archaeological evidence that might have preserved the voices of thralls was often ignored or misinterpreted by scholars who were more interested in the artifacts of free Vikings than the experiences of their slaves. Burial sites that contained the remains of sacrificed thralls were studied for what they revealed about elite funeral practices rather than what they showed about the systematic murder of enslaved people. The perspective of the oppressed was systematically excluded from historical reconstruction. Modern scholarship has begun to recover some of this lost history, but vast gaps remain in our understanding of how slavery actually functioned in Viking society. The voices of thralls themselves are almost entirely absent from the historical record, their experiences filtered through the accounts of their oppressors or inferred from archaeological evidence. We can reconstruct the broad outlines of the system, but the individual human stories of suffering and resistance remain largely invisible. This invisibility is itself part of the legacy of Viking slavery. The systematic dehumanization that characterized the thrall system extended to the historical record, where enslaved people were treated as objects rather than subjects worthy of attention. Their erasure from history was the final insult added to centuries of degradation, ensuring that their suffering would be forgotten while their oppressors were remembered as heroes. The impact of this historical amnesia extends beyond academic scholarship into contemporary culture and politics. The romanticized image of Vikings as noble warriors and explorers has influenced everything from popular entertainment to political movements that seek to claim Viking heritage while ignoring Viking brutality. The selective memory allows modern groups to appropriate Viking symbolism without confronting the reality of what Viking society actually entailed. This pattern of selective historical memory is not unique to Viking slavery. Similar processes have affected the historical understanding of slavery systems throughout the world, where the experiences of the enslaved are marginalized in favor of narratives that focus on the achievements of their oppressors. The result is a distorted view of the past that obscures the true costs of historical progress and makes it easier to repeat similar patterns of exploitation. The true legacy of Viking slavery isn't found in the archaeological remains of elite burials or the literary achievements of saga writers. It's found in the psychological and cultural patterns that were established during centuries of systematic dehumanization, and that continued to influence Scandinavian society long after formal emancipation. The habits of thought that made slavery possible, the social hierarchies that justified exploitation, the cultural values that prioritized wealth and status over human dignity, all persisted in modified forms. Understanding this legacy requires confronting uncomfortable truths about how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil when that evil is normalized by law, custom, and economic incentive. The Vikings who participated in the slave system weren't monsters or psychopaths. They were human beings who created and maintained institutions that systematically destroyed other human beings because those institutions served their interests. The lesson isn't that Vikings were uniquely cruel, but that any society can develop practices of systematic oppression when the right conditions exist. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed Viking masters to view thralls as subhuman property continue to operate in different contexts today. The same economic incentives that drove the slave trade still motivate various forms of human trafficking and exploitation in the modern world. The story of Viking slavery is ultimately a story about the capacity for both cruelty and resistance that exists within human nature. It shows how societies can organize themselves around the principle that some people matter more than others, and how that principle can be sustained through violence, ideology, and economic structure. But it also shows how even the most comprehensive systems of oppression contain contradictions that eventually lead to their transformation or collapse. The thralls whose suffering we've explored didn't live to see the end of the system that oppressed them. Most died in bondage, their hopes for freedom unfulfilled, their voices silenced, their humanity denied. But their resistance, however small and invisible, contributed to the eventual transformation of the society that enslaved them. Their refusal to be completely broken, their maintenance of human connections despite systematic attempts to isolate them, their preservation of dignity in circumstances designed to destroy it, all represented victories that their oppressors never recognized but could never entirely eliminate. The human spirit, it turned out, was more resilient than even the most sophisticated slavery system could accommodate. And that resilience, multiplied across millions of individual lives over centuries of oppression, eventually created pressures that no amount of violence or ideology could contain forever. The Vikings succeeded in enslaving bodies, but they never quite managed to enslave souls. And in the end, that failure to achieve total domination may have been what made their system unsustainable. But the cost of that eventual transformation was measured in generations of human suffering that defies comprehension. Millions of people lived and died as property, their potential unrealized, their contributions unrecognized, their pain dismissed as irrelevant. The price of freedom, when it finally came, had been paid not by those who achieved it, but by those who suffered to make it possible. And that debt, however long forgotten, remains part of the historical record that we ignore at our own peril. The psychological damage extended even beyond the grave. Because in Viking society, death offered no escape from the hierarchy that had defined your entire existence. When your master died, there was a very real chance you'd be murdered to accompany him into the afterlife. Not as an equal, but as eternal property, condemned to serve in whatever realm awaited beyond death. The funeral sacrifices weren't random selections. Masters chose specific thralls based on their value, their perceived loyalty, or sometimes their perceived disloyalty. If you'd been a faithful servant, you might be honored with death. If you'd been troublesome, you might be punished with death. Either way, you died. The reasoning didn't matter. Your life was simply a resource to be expended for your master's comfort in the next world. But here's what made these funeral murders particularly horrific. They were often elaborate affairs, designed to maximize both religious impact and the suffering of the victim. You might be drugged with alcohol to make you compliant, then passed among your master's friends, before being strangled and stabbed on the funeral pyre. Or you could be buried alive in the ship grave, conscious and terrified as tons of earth were shoveled over your head. The witnesses to these murders weren't horrified. They were celebratory. Your death was entertainment, religious duty, and social bonding all rolled into one bloody spectacle. Free Vikings would drink and feast while you died screaming, your agony providing the soundtrack to their party. They saw nothing wrong with this, because you weren't really human to them. You were an object being disposed of properly. Even thralls who managed to avoid selection for funeral sacrifice lived with the constant knowledge that their master's death could trigger their own. Every illness that struck the household, every battle injury, every sign of aging became a potential death sentence. You couldn't even hope for your oppressor's demise because it might mean your own destruction rather than liberation. This created a perverse dynamic where thralls sometimes found themselves genuinely concerned about their master's health and safety, not out of affection, but out of self-preservation. The very people who brutalized you daily became your only protection against an even worse fate. It was psychological torture of the most sophisticated kind, forcing you to care about the welfare of those who treated you as disposable property. The children of thralls grew up knowing they might be killed, simply because someone they were forced to serve had died. Imagine trying to raise a child, to give them hope for the future, while knowing that any day a funeral might require their sacrifice. How do you teach resilience when death could come not from disease or accident, but from religious obligation? How do you maintain sanity when your child's life depends on the continued health of their oppressor? Some thrall mothers tried to prepare their children for this possibility, teaching them prayers or rituals that might ease their passage to whatever came after. Others refused to discuss it, hoping to preserve their children's innocence for as long as possible. But the knowledge was always there, hanging over every family, like a sword, suspended by the thinnest thread. The sexual exploitation of thralls operated on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. Female slaves weren't just occasionally abused by their masters. They were systematically used as breeding stock, sexual entertainment, and disposable objects for male gratification. Their bodies belonged to whoever owned them, and consent was a concept that simply didn't apply to property. Young girls were often selected specifically for sexual purposes, sometimes sold to masters who advertised their intentions openly. The slave markets had special sections for attractive children, with buyers examining them like livestock to assess their potential for various forms of exploitation. Age wasn't a protection. Neither was family relationship. If you were female and owned, you were available. The breeding programs were managed with the same attention to detail that Vikings applied to improving their horses or cattle. Attractive thralls were paired with strong ones to produce children who combined beauty with physical capability. Intelligence was sometimes encouraged, but only when coupled with absolute submission. The goal was to create better human tools, not better human beings. Pregnancy offered no protection from abuse. Pregnant thralls were often worked until the moment of labor, then expected to return to their duties within days of giving birth. Miscarriages caused by overwork or violence were seen as economic losses rather than human tragedies. The women who suffered them were blamed for damaging their master's property rather than mourned for their loss. The children born from these rapes belonged entirely to the master, not to their mothers. Thrall women might be allowed to nurse their babies, but they had no legal relationship to their own children. A master could sell a mother and child separately without any consideration for the emotional bonds between them. Family meant nothing when it came to property management. Male thralls weren't immune from sexual abuse either. Young boys were particularly vulnerable, often selected for their appearance and used by masters who preferred male partners. The shame and trauma of these experiences were compounded by the complete inability to resist or report the abuse. There was no authority to appeal to, no justice system that recognized the rape of slaves as a crime. The psychological impact of this systematic sexual violence extended far beyond the immediate victims. Other thralls were forced to witness the abuse of their family members and friends without being able to intervene. The knowledge that resistance would only lead to worse punishment for everyone created a climate of helpless complicity that ate away at the souls of even those who weren't directly targeted. Some thralls developed elaborate mental defenses to cope with repeated sexual trauma. They learned to dissociate during abuse, mentally separating themselves from their bodies to preserve some fragment of psychological integrity. Others created fantasy lives where they had power, agency, and the ability to protect themselves and their loved ones. These coping mechanisms helped them survive, but they also created psychological damage that lasted for generations. The normalization of sexual violence in Viking society extended beyond just the treatment of slaves. Free women who married into households with thralls often had to accept that their husbands would use female slaves for sexual gratification. Some wives even participated in managing their husbands' sexual exploitation of thralls, selecting which slaves would be used and when. The system corrupted everyone it touched, turning victims into accomplices and witnesses into collaborators. The religious justification for sexual abuse was particularly insidious. Some Vikings convinced themselves that using thralls sexually was actually beneficial for the slaves, exposing them to superior genetic material that might improve their offspring. Others argued that sexual service was simply another form of labor, no different from cooking or cleaning. The capacity for self-deception among oppressors was apparently limitless. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of sexual slavery was how it destroyed the possibility of genuine human connections. Thralls couldn't form lasting romantic relationships because they could be separated at any time. They couldn't protect their children from abuse because they had no legal authority over their own offspring. They couldn't even maintain friendships without risking punishment for unauthorized emotional attachments. This systematic destruction of human bonds was intentional. Vikings understood that people who loved each other might take risks to protect one another. Isolated individuals, cut off from emotional support, were far easier to control than people embedded in networks of mutual care. Loneliness was weaponized as effectively as any chain or whip. The few thralls who somehow managed to maintain emotional connections despite these obstacles faced constant anxiety about losing what little they had. A friendship could be ended by sale or transfer. A romantic relationship could be terminated by the master's whim. Even parent-child bonds could be severed without warning or explanation. Love became a vulnerability that masters could exploit whenever they needed additional leverage over their human property. Some thralls tried to protect themselves by avoiding emotional attachments entirely. They learned to view other slaves as competitors rather than allies, fellow victims rather than potential friends. This emotional shutdown was a survival mechanism, but it also meant that even when freedom eventually became possible, many former slaves found themselves unable to form the human connections that might have helped them build new lives. The work that thralls were forced to perform was designed not just to generate economic value, but to break their spirits through endless repetition and meaningless toil. You might spend months hauling stones from one pile to another, only to be ordered to move them back to the original location. The futility was intentional. Vikings understood that purposeless labor was more psychologically destructive than even the hardest meaningful work. The agricultural tasks that occupied most thralls were backbreaking and dangerous. You'd work the rocky Scandinavian soil with primitive tools, often barefoot and inadequately clothed. Injuries were common, and medical care was non-existent. A cut from a scythe might fester into a life-threatening infection. A fall while harvesting could leave you permanently disabled. But you kept working until your body gave out completely. The domestic labor performed by household thralls was equally demanding, but differently degrading. You'd wake before dawn to light fires, haul water, and prepare food for people who saw you as barely more intelligent than their livestock. You'd clean human waste, wash filthy clothes, and maintain living spaces for families who treated your own comfort as completely irrelevant. The skilled work that some thralls performed was perhaps the most psychologically damaging of all. If you were a blacksmith, you'd forge weapons that might be used to capture more slaves like yourself. If you were a shipbuilder, you'd craft the vessels that carried raiders to distant shores in search of human cargo. Your own skills and talents were turned against your people, making you complicit in perpetuating the system that oppressed you. The economic calculations that governed thrall labor were coldly precise. Masters knew exactly how many calories you needed to remain functional, how many hours you could work before collapsing, how much abuse you could endure before becoming completely useless. They managed their human property like any other investment, maximizing returns while minimizing costs. This economic approach to human management created a particularly cruel dynamic around aging and disability. As your physical capabilities declined, your value as property decreased correspondingly. Masters had no incentive to care for elderly or disabled thralls who couldn't contribute to household productivity. Many were simply abandoned when they became too weak to work, left to starve or freeze in whatever shelter they could find. The knowledge that your usefulness was entirely dependent on your physical capacity created constant anxiety among thralls. Every injury, every sign of illness, every indication of aging became a potential death sentence. You learned to hide pain, to work through injuries that should have required rest, to push your body beyond safe limits just to maintain your minimal value as property. The seasonal rhythms that governed Viking life created their own patterns of suffering for thralls. Winter meant being trapped indoors with your oppressors for months, breathing stale air thick with smoke and human waste. The long darkness was broken only by the flickering of inadequate fires that provided warmth for free people, while slaves shivered in corners. Food became even more scarce as stored provisions dwindled, and thralls were the first to feel the effects of rationing. Spring brought the terror of raiding season, when young male thralls might be selected for military expeditions that they were unlikely to survive. You'd be given minimal weapons training and thrown into battles where your life had less value than a decent sword. If you died, you'd be replaced. If you survived, you'd be expected to participate in capturing more slaves to share your fate. Summer meant endless labor under the midnight sun that never set. The continuous daylight that tourists find charming today was a curse for thralls who worked 18-hour days without rest. The heat that free Vikings could escape by seeking shade was inescapable for slaves who had to maintain their labor regardless of weather conditions. Autumn brought the anxiety of harvest time, when the success or failure of crops could determine whether you'd have enough food to survive the coming winter. A bad harvest meant reduced rations for thralls, and reduced rations often meant death for the weakest members of the slave population. You'd watch fellow thralls grow thin and weak, knowing that you might be next if the weather didn't cooperate. The tools you were given to perform this endless labor were deliberately inadequate. Masters provided the minimum necessary equipment to maintain productivity, while ensuring that thralls couldn't use their tools as weapons. You'd work with dull blades that made every task harder, broken handles that cut your hands, implements so worn that they barely functioned. The inefficiency was intentional, designed to make your work more difficult and your life more miserable. The clothing provided to thralls was similarly calculated to maximize discomfort while maintaining basic functionality. Rough wool that chafed your skin, inadequate shoes that fell apart after weeks of use, garments that were deliberately too small or too large to fit properly. You learned to live with constant physical irritation that served as a reminder of your status every moment of every day. The food given to thralls was designed to keep you alive and working, nothing more. Spoiled meat, mouldy bread, thin gruel made from scraps and bones. You ate what you were given when you were given it, grateful for anything that might sustain you through another day of labor. Hunger became your constant companion, a gnawing reminder that your survival depended entirely on your master's calculation of your economic value. The psychological techniques used to control thralls were sophisticated and deliberately cruel. Masters would alternate unpredictable kindness with random brutality, creating a pattern of intermittent reinforcement that made you desperate for any sign of approval. You'd work harder for a kind word than you would to avoid a beating, because hope was more powerful than fear in motivating long-term compliance. The isolation tactics were equally effective. Thralls who formed friendships were separated. Those who showed leadership qualities were transferred or eliminated. Any sign of collective identity among slaves was crushed before it could develop into organized resistance. You learned to mistrust other thralls, to compete rather than cooperate, to view fellow victims as threats rather than allies. The constant surveillance meant that you never had a moment of true privacy or autonomy. Masters and their agents watched everything you did, listened to everything you said, monitored every interaction you had with other slaves. Even your thoughts weren't entirely your own, as you were regularly interrogated about your mental state and forced to confess any feelings of discontent or rebellion. This total control extended to every aspect of your existence. You couldn't choose what to eat, when to sleep, how to spend your few moments of rest, or even how to respond to pain. Every aspect of human agency was systematically removed until you existed in a state of complete dependence on those who owned you. The goal wasn't just to control your labor, but to eliminate your capacity for independent thought or action. The religious indoctrination that accompanied this physical and psychological control was designed to make you complicit in your own oppression. You were taught that your enslavement was divinely ordained, that resistance was not just futile but blasphemous, that your suffering had meaning only insofar as it served your betters. The gods themselves, according to your masters, had decreed your inferior status and demanded your submission. But even in this comprehensive system of control, even under conditions designed to crush every spark of human dignity, resistance continued to flicker. Small acts of defiance that risked terrible punishment but preserved some fragment of self-respect. Shared glances of understanding between thralls that created momentary connections in a world designed to isolate. Tiny gestures of kindness that affirmed the humanity your masters tried to deny. These acts of resistance were invisible to your oppressors and meaningless in any practical sense. They didn't weaken the chains or challenge the system, but they kept alive something essential that even the most sophisticated slavery couldn't quite extinguish. The knowledge that what was being done to you was wrong, even if you couldn't articulate why or imagine alternatives. The stubborn refusal to accept that your suffering was natural or deserved, even when every authority figure told you otherwise. This spark of resistance would prove more important than anyone could have imagined, not because it led to successful rebellion or dramatic escape, but because it preserved the possibility of humanity in circumstances designed to eliminate it entirely. And that possibility, however small and however hidden, contained within it the seeds of something that would eventually grow beyond the reach of any master's control. The true horror of being a Viking slave wasn't just the physical brutality or the economic exploitation. It was the systematic attempt to convince you that you deserved your fate, that you were naturally inferior, that your suffering was cosmically justified. It was a machine designed not just to extract labor from human bodies, but to crush human souls so completely that the victims would become willing participants in their own oppression. But machines, no matter how sophisticated, sometimes break down in unexpected ways, and the Viking slave system, for all its efficiency and brutality, contained contradictions that would eventually lead to its transformation. Not because of successful resistance by thralls, but because the very success of the system created conditions that made it unsustainable over time. The economic dependencies that slavery created made Viking society vulnerable to changes in the broader world. The cultural values that justified human ownership came into conflict with new religious and political ideas. The psychological costs of maintaining such a system began to outweigh the benefits, even for those who profited from it. And through it all, in ways that no one fully understood at the time, the refusal of enslaved people to be completely broken was slowly changing the world around them, not through dramatic acts of rebellion, but through the persistent demonstration that human dignity could survive even the most determined attempts to destroy it. The thralls, whose suffering we've explored tonight, didn't live to see the end of the system that oppressed them, but their endurance, their resistance, and their refusal to accept that their degradation was natural or permanent created ripples that would eventually reach shores they could never have imagined. The spark of humanity they preserved in the darkest possible circumstances would outlive the masters who tried to extinguish it, outlive the economic system that exploited it, and outlive the civilization that depended on its suppression. Because in the end, that's what makes the story of Viking slavery both horrifying and hopeful. The demonstration that human beings can endure unimaginable suffering while still maintaining something essential about their humanity. The proof that even the most comprehensive systems of oppression cannot completely eliminate the human capacity for dignity, compassion, and hope. The cost of preserving that spark was measured in millions of lives, in generations of suffering, in trauma that echoed through centuries. But the fact that it survived at all, That even under conditions designed to eliminate every trace of human worth, some people still found ways to affirm their essential dignity, stands as one of the most powerful testimonies to the resilience of the human spirit that history has to offer. That's the legacy of the Viking thralls, not their submission to an unjust system, but their refusal to be completely broken by it. Not their acceptance of their assigned inferiority, but their quiet insistence on their essential humanity. Not their failure to escape their chains, but their success in preserving something that no chain could ultimately hold. And perhaps that's the most important lesson we can learn from their suffering, that the human spirit, however battered and oppressed, contains something indestructible, something that can survive the worst that other humans can devise, something that, given time and the right conditions, can grow into forces powerful enough to transform the world. The thralls are gone now, their voices silenced, their stories mostly forgotten, but the spark they preserved still burns. In every person who refuses to accept that suffering is natural or deserved, in every individual who chooses compassion over cruelty, in every soul that insists on the fundamental dignity of human beings, regardless of their circumstances. That spark, kindled in the darkest corners of Viking slave quarters and kept alive through centuries of oppression, continues to light the way toward a world where no human being is treated as property, where no child is born into bondage, where no person's worth is measured by their usefulness to others. It's a light that the Vikings, for all their sophistication and power, could never quite extinguish. And it burns still, a testament to the thralls who suffered to keep it alive, and a promise that their sacrifice was not in vain. The psychological aftermath of the Viking slave system didn't end with legal emancipation. For the former thralls who lived to see freedom, the transition was often more traumatic than liberating. Imagine spending your entire life believing you were subhuman property, only to suddenly be told you were free. Free to do what? Free to go where? Free to become who? Many former slaves had no framework for understanding freedom because they had never experienced it. The concept of making choices, of owning your own time, of determining your own fate was so foreign that it felt overwhelming rather than empowering. Some voluntarily remained with their former masters simply because the known horror of slavery felt safer than the unknown terror of independence. The practical challenges were equally daunting. Former thralls owned nothing. They had no money, no property, no skills beyond basic manual labor, no social connections, no understanding of how free society functioned. They were like children released into an adult world without preparation or support, expected to navigate complex social and economic systems they had never been allowed to understand. The social stigma attached to slave ancestry created additional barriers that persisted for generations. Even when legal slavery ended, former thralls and their descendants were marked as inferior by their history. They faced discrimination in employment, housing, marriage, and social interaction that limited their opportunities for advancement. Freedom existed on paper, but equality remained a distant dream. The intergenerational trauma passed down through families was profound and lasting. Children whose parents had been slaves inherited not just poverty and social disadvantage, but psychological patterns of submission, fear, and learned helplessness that had been necessary for survival under bondage. These trauma responses, adaptive in slavery, became obstacles to success in freedom. Some former thralls developed what we might recognize today as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. They struggled with depression, anxiety, hypervigilance, and emotional numbness that made it difficult to form relationships or pursue opportunities. The survival mechanisms that had protected them in slavery became prisons that trapped them in poverty and isolation even after emancipation. The family structures that slavery had destroyed proved nearly impossible to rebuild. Former thralls often had no idea what had happened to parents, children, or siblings who had been sold away years earlier. The emotional bonds that might have provided support during the transition to freedom had been severed by the slave system itself. Many former slaves found themselves alone in a world that offered theoretical freedom, but little practical assistance. The religious and cultural identity of former slaves had also been damaged by their experiences. Many had been forced to abandon their original beliefs and adopt Norse practices, but they had never been fully accepted into Viking religious communities. They existed in a spiritual limbo, cut off from their ancestral traditions, but not truly incorporated into their captors' faith. The irony was cruel and complete. After centuries of being told they were worthless, former thralls were suddenly expected to value themselves. After lifetimes of having every decision made for them, they were required to make choices they had never been prepared for. After generations of being isolated from one another, they were supposed to form communities and support networks from nothing. Some former slaves retreated into patterns of behavior that mimicked their former bondage. They sought out employers who would make all their decisions for them, accepted wages that barely covered survival, and avoided situations that required initiative or independence. The chains had been removed, but the mental conditioning that made chains unnecessary remained firmly in place. Others swung in the opposite direction, becoming so determined to prove their freedom that they made reckless choices that often led to disaster. Without the experience necessary to evaluate risks or opportunities, some former thralls fell victim to schemes and frauds that left them worse off than they had been in slavery. Their desperate hunger for dignity made them easy targets for exploitation. The few former slaves who managed to achieve genuine success often found themselves caught between two worlds. Too educated and prosperous to fit in with other former thralls, but still marked by their ancestry and excluded from full acceptance by free society. They became living proof that advancement was possible, but also reminders of how rare and difficult such advancement actually was. The economic opportunities available to former slaves were severely limited by both practical constraints and social prejudice. Most had been deliberately kept ignorant of any skills beyond basic manual labor. They lacked the capital necessary to start businesses, the connections required for advancement, and the cultural knowledge needed to navigate complex economic relationships. They were free to compete in markets that were rigged against them from the start. The legal system that had once treated them as property now offered theoretical protection, but little practical recourse. Former thralls could be cheated, assaulted, or discriminated against with minimal consequences for their oppressors. The same social structures that had enabled slavery continued to marginalize its former victims, just in more subtle and legally acceptable ways. The housing available to former slaves was often barely better than what they had experienced in bondage. Cramped, unsanitary conditions in neighborhoods that free society had abandoned to poverty and neglect. The spatial segregation that had once separated slave quarters from free households evolved into residential patterns that kept former thralls isolated and invisible. Education, when it was available at all, was designed to produce compliant workers rather than independent thinkers. Former slaves and their children were taught basic literacy and numeracy, but not the critical thinking skills or cultural knowledge that might have enabled them to challenge their continued marginalization. They were educated just enough to be useful, but not enough to be threatening. The healthcare available to former thralls reflected their continued second-class status. They received minimal medical attention, often from practitioners who viewed them as inherently inferior and less deserving of care. The malnutrition, injuries, and diseases accumulated during slavery often went untreated, creating lifelong disabilities that further limited their opportunities. The psychological support that might have helped former slaves process their trauma and adapt to freedom simply didn't exist. Medieval society had no understanding of mental health or therapeutic intervention. Former thralls were expected to simply move on from their experiences without acknowledgement of the damage that had been done or assistance in healing from it. Despite all these obstacles, some former thralls did manage to create meaningful lives after emancipation. They formed communities, established businesses, raised families, and preserved cultural traditions that connected them to pre-slavery identities. These success stories were rare and required extraordinary resilience, but they demonstrated that the human capacity for renewal could survive even the most systematic attempts at destruction. The cultural contributions of former slaves and their descendants gradually enriched Scandinavian society in ways that were rarely acknowledged or appreciated. They brought knowledge of crafts, techniques, stories, and perspectives that had survived from their original homelands. This cultural fusion happened quietly and without recognition, but it made Norse society more diverse and dynamic than it had been before. The music, art, and oral traditions that emerged from former slave communities often contained hidden critiques of the society that had oppressed them. Through songs, stories, and cultural practices that seemed harmless to outside observers, they preserved memories of injustice and maintained hopes for true equality that would take centuries to achieve. The religious practices of former thralls evolved into syncretic traditions that blended Christian teachings with elements from their ancestral faiths and their experiences of suffering. These hybrid spiritual traditions offered comfort and meaning that neither pure Christianity nor abandoned paganism could provide alone. They created sacred spaces where former slaves could process their trauma and maintain their dignity. The economic innovations developed by former slave communities often emerged from necessity, but proved valuable to broader society. Techniques for surviving on minimal resources, methods for cooperative labor and mutual support, and strategies for navigating hostile economic environments all contributed to the gradual transformation of Scandinavian society. The political consciousness that slowly developed among former thralls and their descendants would eventually contribute to broader movements for social justice and equality. While they rarely had direct political power, their experiences of oppression and their struggles for dignity planted seeds that would grow into later challenges to hierarchical social structures. The intermarriage between former slaves and free people, while socially discouraged and often economically difficult, gradually broke down some of the barriers that had separated enslaved and free populations. These relationships were rarely equal or fully accepted, but they did create family networks that crossed traditional social boundaries. The military service that some former thralls provided to Scandinavian kingdoms gave them opportunities to prove their worth and earn respect that had been denied them in civilian life. While they often faced discrimination, even in military contexts, their service sometimes opened doors to advancement that would have been impossible otherwise. The geographic mobility that freedom theoretically provided allowed some former slaves to escape the social constraints of their birthplaces and create new identities in distant locations. While most lacked the resources for long-distance travel, those who could manage it sometimes found communities where their history was unknown and their opportunities less constrained. The entrepreneurial activities of former thralls often began as survival strategies, but evolved into legitimate businesses that served both former slave communities and broader society. These enterprises faced enormous obstacles and often failed, but they demonstrated economic capabilities that slavery had been designed to suppress. The intellectual achievements of former slaves and their descendants challenged prevailing assumptions about the natural inferiority of enslaved peoples. While formal education was limited, some former thralls became skilled craftsmen, knowledgeable healers, or respected community leaders whose abilities could not be dismissed or ignored. The moral authority that came from having survived extreme oppression gave some former slaves a unique voice in discussions of justice and social responsibility. While their perspectives were often marginalized or dismissed, their experiences provided insights into human nature and social organization that privileged observers could never achieve. The resistance networks that had operated in secret during slavery sometimes evolved into mutual aid societies that helped former thralls navigate the challenges of freedom. These organizations provided practical support, social connection, and collective advocacy that individual former slaves could never have achieved alone. The memory preservation efforts of former slave communities ensured that the experiences of bondage would not be completely forgotten or sanitized by those who preferred to ignore uncomfortable historical truths. Through oral traditions, cultural practices, and sometimes written accounts, they maintained records of suffering and resistance that challenged official narratives. The healing practices developed by former slaves often combined medical knowledge from their ancestral cultures with techniques learned during slavery and innovations born from necessity. These medical traditions sometimes proved more effective than conventional treatments and gradually gained acceptance in broader society. The legal advocacy undertaken by some former thralls and their descendants slowly expanded protections for vulnerable populations and challenged the legal frameworks that had enabled oppression. While progress was slow and often reversed, these efforts laid groundwork for future advances in human rights. The educational initiatives launched by former slave communities often began as efforts to teach basic literacy, but evolved into broader programs that preserved cultural knowledge and prepared new generations for opportunities that their parents had been denied. These schools operated on minimal resources, but achieved remarkable results. The artistic expressions created by former thralls and their descendants often encoded messages of resistance, hope, and cultural preservation that could be shared safely within their communities while remaining invisible to hostile outsiders. These art forms became vehicles for maintaining identity and processing trauma. The spiritual leadership provided by some former slaves created alternative religious communities that offered more inclusive and compassionate interpretations of divine will than the traditional churches that had blessed their oppression. These spiritual leaders often became powerful advocates for social justice. The technological innovations developed by former slave communities were born from necessity, but sometimes proved valuable to broader society. Techniques for efficient production, resource conservation, and cooperative labor emerged from the survival skills that slavery had required. The social experiments undertaken by former thrall communities as they tried to create new forms of organization and cooperation sometimes pointed toward more egalitarian and humane ways of structuring society. While most of these experiments failed due to external pressures, they demonstrated possibilities that would inspire future reformers. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the former thralls was simply their persistence in asserting their humanity, despite centuries of systematic dehumanization. Their refusal to accept the labels of inferiority that had been imposed on them. Their determination to create dignity and meaning in circumstances designed to eliminate both. And their commitment to building better lives for their children despite overwhelming obstacles all testified to something indestructible in the human spirit. The transformation from slavery to freedom was never complete for the first generations of former thralls. Too much damage had been done. Too many opportunities had been lost. Too many barriers remained in place. But their struggles created possibilities for their descendants that would not have existed otherwise. Each small victory, each preserved tradition, each act of resistance or dignity added to a legacy that would eventually grow beyond anything their oppressors could have imagined. The story of the Viking thralls doesn't end with emancipation because the effects of slavery echoed through generations. But it also doesn't end in despair because the human capacity for renewal, resistance, and hope proved stronger than even the most comprehensive system of oppression. The spark of dignity that survived in the darkest corners of slave quarters eventually grew into flames that would light the way toward a more just and humane world. Today, when we walk through the museums that display Viking artifacts, when we read the sagas that celebrate Norse heroes, when we admire the ships and weapons and jewelry that showcase Viking craftsmanship, we should remember the hands that made these treasures possible. The thralls who built the longships, forged the swords, crafted the ornaments, and hauled the stones that built the halls where their masters feasted. Their names are lost, their voices silenced, their suffering forgotten by most. But their labor created the civilization we study. Their resistance preserved the humanity we value, and their legacy challenges us to build a world where no human being is ever again reduced to property. That may be the most important lesson we can learn from their ordeal. That freedom is not a gift bestowed by the powerful, but a birthright that must be defended by all of us, for all of us, forever. The chains that bound the Viking thralls have long since rusted away. But the principles they represent, the idea that some people matter more than others, that suffering can be justified by profit, that human dignity is negotiable, these chains are forged anew in every generation. Breaking them requires the same courage, the same persistence, the same refusal to accept injustice that the thralls demonstrated in their darkest hours. Their story is not just history, it's a warning and a promise. A warning about what humans can do to one another when cruelty is normalized and profitable, and a promise that even in the deepest darkness, even under the most oppressive systems, the human spirit can survive and eventually prevail. The Viking Age ended centuries ago, but the age of human dignity is still being written. And every time we choose compassion over cruelty, justice over profit, humanity over hierarchy, we honor the memory of those who suffered to make such choices possible. The thralls may be gone, but their legacy lives on in every act of resistance to oppression, every defense of the vulnerable, every affirmation that all human beings possess an inherent worth that no power on earth can legitimately deny. That's their gift to us across the centuries. Not just the knowledge of what they endured, but the proof that it could be endured. Not just the memory of their suffering, but the example of their unbroken spirit. Not just the history of their bondage, but the hope of our freedom. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's everything. The knowledge that even in the worst of times, even under the most brutal conditions, something essential about human dignity survives. And that survival, however costly, however painful, however incomplete, contains within it the seeds of a better world for all of us. The story of the Viking thralls is over. But the story they helped write, the story of humanity's long struggle toward justice and dignity, continues. And in that continuing story, their sacrifice was not in vain. Their suffering was not meaningless. Their resistance was not futile. They were slaves, but they were never broken. They were property, but they were always human. They were silenced, but their voices still speak to anyone willing to listen. And what they tell us, across the centuries of pain and hope, is simple and profound. Endure, resist, remember. The darkness is real, but it is not eternal. And somewhere beyond the night, the dawn is always coming.